check out this basalt boulder behind me. It's huge. It's probably 15 feet high and maybe 10 or 12 feet across. I mean, this is a massive chunk of a rock. And this kind of basalt is a really good example of a lot of the rock that makes up the mountains of Washington State. We're kind of a really cool mix of a whole bunch of different kinds of stones. And this one looks like it may have fallen off of the peak that's behind me. So let's go in a little bit. I think I see a spot that we can get over to where it looks like maybe the landslide happened and it's open. Let's go check it out. Okay, so just inside the forest edge from where we found that really big boulder, there's this large rubble field. You can kind of see it all and around behind me. And that's a really good sign that at some point in the recent past, a landslide came through and plowed this whole area out. And one of the things that I think is especially cool is this shows us a really good example of what's called succession, which is one of the most important concepts in ecology. So succession is basically a way to describe the stages that an ecosystem moves through after what's called a disturbance. So a disturbance is anything that either takes out, knocks down, moves away, or otherwise significantly alters an individual habitat. So this chunk here is a really great example of where a disturbance has come through. So you can see this big old Douglas fir root behind me. That shows us that the forest here was pretty big before this landslide happened, and that this knocked over during that time. So it left basically just all these stones. So then we actually can see in this space some of the actual changes that have happened in those stages. I'm really excited to show them. After this landslide came through and left kind of a small patch of basically barren rocky wasteland right here, the first stage of succession is this stuff. So this is moss. We are quite close to it. So here's my finger for scale, but this is a really deep layer, and that means for a while this moss has been growing here. And as the moss grows and other little smaller plants start to grow on top of it, like these licorice ferns, they die and their materials fall down into the moss and they start building up soil. And as the soil builds up, other plants can start to grow. So this trailing blackberry is growing inside this moss and spreading out, and it'll add its own nutrients and its own leaves to build up more and more soil as it grows. Once the moss has managed to build up a deep enough layer and enough material has rotted away, those other plants have added lots of nice nutrients to the soil, larger shrubs like these thimbleberry behind me are able to grow in that little bit deeper layer of soil. And again, they continue to build up and add those nutrients, and each species of plant adds something different. So some plants add nitrogen, which is really important for things like shrubs to be able to grow, and especially if you ever want to get trees. Just kind of a fun fact about thimbleberry too. If you touch it, it's very soft. Many people call it nature's toilet paper or the Charmin of the forest. As that soil layer deepens and time goes by and the seasons start to progress, the seeds from trees surrounding the place where the disturbance happens start to blow in or be carried by birds or arrive in a variety of ways. It just depends on the individual species. But the fastest growing trees are able to start. And here in the Northwest, our fastest growing trees tend to be broadleaf trees. You can see many of these vine maples growing up and out of this deeper layer of soil and reaching up towards the sun as they go. While those more rapid growing broadleaf trees are gaining size and reaching out, spreading towards all of the light that's now available because the landslide knocked out all of the trees that were here previously, slower growing, particularly conifers, so things like hemlocks, Douglas firs, western red cedar, species of trees that carry their seeds inside cones, are growing and reaching towards the light and will eventually replace the broadleaf trees as the dominant one in the forest. And we can see here on the edge of the landslide exactly the stage that the forest was in before this chunk came down. But what that shows us is that it's really important to have trees kind of on the edge, because all of those trees over there are what actually provided the seeds and cones for this space to grow. So although Northwest forests are really resilient and can come back from pretty catastrophic events, it's really important that there are at least sources of seeds and resources for animals and plants to be able to return and recover those areas. The final stage of succession in the Pacific Northwest is what we call a climax forest. So as the trees have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, they've had a longer and longer time where they've shaded the forest floor. So you have a decreasing amount of undergrowth, but you allow shade-loving species like sword fern and huckleberry to be able to grow where they wouldn't have been able to before. So the trees carry along other species in their stages of succession. Now, even this, where you can see a pretty large Douglas fir behind me, it's probably about 3.5, 4 feet across, which is pretty big compared to most of the other trees that I've been able to see so far today, but is nothing compared to what it once was. Most of the lowlands in the Pacific Northwest were logged in the late 18 and early 1900s. And actually the reason that we have cities like San Francisco, Portland, Olympia, Seattle is because of Douglas fir trees like this. These made the beams for most of the cities on the West Coast. So if you are ever in any of those towns, you have a little bit of Washington with you, which I think is pretty cool. But because of that, most of the forests here in Washington are nowhere near their climax age. The last major logging events were probably in the 40s or 50s. And since then, we've had a lot of growth, and we've done a pretty good job protecting our forests and starting to encourage those groups of trees to grow and come back. So hopefully in the next 50, 80 years, we'll be able to come back to this spot. And this tree may be as big across as I am tall. So that would be pretty cool. So aside from all the cool stuff that I hope you learned about succession on today's episode, I think something that we always need to address when we talk about things like logging and resource extraction is finding that right balance. Because for some people, maybe we don't need any more wood. Maybe forests are much more important and there's enough space and land and other resources that we could use to make sure that these kinds of forests are here for forever. But then for other people, maybe we want a mix. Maybe we can log forests the same way natural disturbance happens on small plots, like we saw with that rubble pile and from the landslide, because, you know, that's the natural pattern. And other people feel, well, no, you know, people need to come first. There are people who don't have homes. There are people who need their businesses to run. We need schools and properties, and one of the best ways to do that is with wood. It regrows. So I hope that you've gotten a little bit out of the story of that story today, and that you can take some of that information and make those decisions for yourself, because it's, in the end, we're all just trying to figure it out, and we all want the world to be a better place, but we have to decide for ourselves what that looks like. So I really enjoyed taking you around this forest today. My name, again, is Patrick Hutchins, and I hope you had fun joining me today. Oh man, I totally forgot to tell you guys something really cool about basalt. Basalt is what we call an igneous rock, which means that it actually used to be lava. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I'm literally holding frozen lava in my hands. Anyway, I'm sure we'll talk more about geology because it's really freaking cool. All right, that's the actual end of the episode. Back to whatever it is you were doing a second ago.